Yeah. Well, what's happening in Libya and Syria is part of what's been dubbed the Arab Spring, as protesters across the region demand reform. Well, the Economist Intelligence Unit has been studying this phenomenon that has been playing out for the past 6 or so months, and it's released a report titled Spring Tide: Will the Arab Risings Yield Democracy, Dictatorship or Disorder? Well, the report's author is David Butler, who is the Economist Intelligence Unit's Regional Director for the Middle East and North Africa, and he joins us live now from our London studio. David Butler, thanks so much for your time. If we go back 12 months, could you have imagined that a year on we'd be talking about a whole string of popular uprisings through this region?
Certainly not. I think we'd got used to seeing very little actual change in the Middle East. But that doesn't mean that we and other observers weren't aware of that inertia or stability, if you like, being very unsatisfactory and actually having within it the seeds of some kinds of uprising. But we, and I don't think anybody else, could have predicted it being such a region-wide phenomenon, and certainly in the early stages having had such dramatic results in terms of overthrowing two regimes.
Let's go to the question posed in the title of your report. While acknowledging, of course, that each territory is different, will these uprisings yield democracy, dictatorship or disorder in the region?
Well, our report, we tend to try to put out scenarios with some kind of probability attached. I think we came at it with a view that this was a revolutionary change and it could potentially be transformative. But the idea that the uprisings would result in an easy transition to democracy and a general improvement in governance and consequently better economic performance wasn't so easy to justify. So we've come up with a main scenario of a kind of disorderly democracy. I think we're relatively optimistic that the changes will hold in Egypt and Tunisia. And that there will be some improvement in terms of democracy rankings that we do also for those countries. But now, as we've seen, just heard on your program, in Libya, in Syria, of course, in Yemen, and Bahrain, we've seen that the forces for democracy have suffered some pretty serious setbacks. And so it's very much in the balance in those countries. I think the critical factor for me certainly is how Egypt performs with the tests coming up with democratic elections and presidential elections. And a lot of that will be how the Muslim Brotherhood current fits into this new kind of democratic structure. It's going to be difficult. There's dangers of backlash from the old establishment. There's extremist factions on the Islamist side. But I certainly think that, our view is that there will be an improvement in Egypt. And the better it gets in Egypt, I think the more positive the chances are for this Arab Spring, if you like, for these revolutions to have a salutary effect across the region as a whole.
Let's move on to two other areas that are very much in the news right now. In fact, our first two reports are focused on them, Syria and Libya. With Syria, you say the most likely outcome is that the regime will survive. But given the protests haven't gone away, despite the apparent brutal suppression of them, why do you arrive at that conclusion?
Well, I think if you look at what happened elsewhere, you see a very important ingredient was separation between the head of state and the army. The army managed to act in an autonomous way and was crucial to changing things. In Syria, the regime and the armed forces, the security forces as a whole, are very tightly woven together. The regime is far more present in all parts of society. And I think that they also have no real sense of restraint in terms of how far they'll go in butchering their own population if necessary. They've done it before. So we couldn't really see a way in which the regime would be easily pushed aside and the process of rebuilding would come forward. But, as we know, Syria is very finely poised. Things could change very fast. There could be splits inside the regime. We could see some forces inside the army turning on the Assad regime. But all in all, we see it's surviving. I mean, it's not a very kind of pleasant scenario, and I think many of us from the outside looking in at the people opposing the regime would kind of wish them well. The other thing in Syria, of course, is that we haven't yet seen mass opposition coming out in Damascus, the capital, or in Aleppo, the biggest city in Syria, about 5 million people there, and the commercial and business center of the country. So until that happens on a really major scale, I think, unfortunately, we see the Assad sticking around for a while.
And Libya, how do you think that will eventually play out?
Well, I think eventually the Gaddafi regime will go, but it is proving very difficult to dislodge. And as we've seen, the fact it's turned into a military conflict in which NATO's involved but is holding back has meant that we're in effect seeing some front lines being established. We do see the genesis of a new state over in the west with the Transitional National Council, but Gaddafi and the old members of the regime seems to be holding on in Tripoli. I think ultimately there will be steady defections from inside the Gaddafi regime, and that in 6 months or a year's time he'll be gone. And I think that there is probably enough common ground between people on the fringes of the Gaddafi regime and the Transitional National Council to reforge some sense of national unity. But certainly there's quite a big risk that we're effectively going to see the country partition for some time to come, and with the outside forces being drawn steadily into the conflict, or continuing to be involved for a long time.
With the uncertainty that these uprisings have created, there's been concern whether Al-Qaeda will take advantage of all of this and gain a stronger foothold. But you say in your report that these uprisings have been by and large a setback for the terrorist organisation. Why have you arrived at that?
Well, I think we've seen Al-Qaeda's credibility as a force around which the masses can rally has taken a knock. I think in Iraq it really was exposed by even people with extreme Islamist ideology as being excessively brutal towards other Muslims, so that the Al-Qaeda star was waning in a way. In Yemen, of course, it's managed to establish a new foothold and is quite a significant player there. But that's mainly because of its failure in Saudi Arabia to really make inroads. So Al-Qaeda, in terms of a group which is using extreme violence as a major part of its strategy, I think certainly is on the retreat. And the fact that the masses moved in Egypt, for example, in a very peaceful way, with no reference at all to the sort of extremist ideology of Al-Qaeda, means that the organization, I don't think, really has a leg to stand on. At the same time, of course, we are seeing in Egypt and elsewhere other quite extreme Islamist groups coming forward and being part of the political process, not necessarily violent, although there have been some cases of violence in Egypt with attacks on the Christian minority, but not violent in the kind of way that Al-Qaeda was. So I don't think the ideology, the general territory that Al-Qaeda operates in terms of its views is gone, but the organization itself, the kind of high-profile, attention-grabbing terrorist attacks, they maybe are, thankfully, something that we're not going to see so much of.
So, David, if the result of all of this is, to use your term, disorderly democracy and also diluted dictatorships, in the years to come, how significant do you think this so-called Arab Spring will prove to be, not just for the region, but for the world?
Well, I think our conclusion is rather sobering. I mean, I'm loath to try to play down the significance of what's happened. And certainly it is important and very important for the people involved. But I think our conclusions are that it'll have limited resonance. It'll move things forward a little bit, but I don't think it'll be a kind of epoch-making inflection like the fall of the Berlin Wall or something like that. that it's important breakthrough, or it's an important breach in the wall of poor governance, of authoritarianism in the Middle East. But there's a long way to go. And our kind of cold-eyed look at the reality on the ground in most of these countries suggests to us that it's really only very much a start has been made on this process.
David Butler from the Economist Intelligence Unit, thanks so much for sharing your time and your knowledge tonight.
Thank you.